Good evening, everyone. I'm going to unmask myself, and now you see who I really am. I'm Lee Tevereau, Adult Services Librarian here at Rochambeau. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. With Thanksgiving right around the corner, it feels like an appropriate time to consider what we know, what we think we know, and what we don't know about that first storied Thanksgiving that we all learned about in elementary school. By now, we know that the story is an amalgam of real events, wishful thinking, and whitewashing. We are here this evening to learn about some of the early encounters between Native Americans and European settlers and their immense repercussions over the past 4 centuries. We're fortunate to have 2 people who are steeped in that history and remain actively engaged in the preservation of a culture and a land irreversibly changed by European settlement to speak with us this evening. John Brown III is Narragansett Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Medicine Man for the Narragansett Tribe. Dr. Paul Robinson is former state archaeologist for Rhode Island at the Rhode Island Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission. And John and Paul have worked together for many years, and each of them brings their own knowledge and perspective to this evening's discussion. Please welcome John and Paul.
Hi. I'm retired. So I'm Paul Robinson. I was state archaeologist for 30-some years, and while I was doing that, I taught part-time at Rhode Island College with Pierre Mornant, who was in the back of the room. This is like old reunion days for John, Pierre, and me, because we did a lot of work together. So tonight we're talking about Thanksgiving myths and what they don't tell us. And so this was Lee's idea.
Blame me.
And so I had to really think hard about, well, what is this myth? And so after talking to a lot of smart people about it, I've sort of boiled it down to this. And that is, there's this idea at the base of American society, at the base of our civilization, that the initial encounter between Indian people and the Pilgrims out in Plymouth was a harmonious time of food sharing, the first Thanksgiving. There's an iconic image that I'll show you in a little while. It was painted in 1912, which shows this feast, this sharing of food. But the trouble with these myths, or these iconic images, is they become fixed in time. And it's as if, to make this mythic, it's as if nothing happened before or nothing happened after. And so before that sharing of food, which lasted for 3 days, and maybe there were, 200 people there, on a huge, huge continent, with millions of years of history. So 3 days for a couple hundred people have shaped the way a lot of people think about American history. As Jill Lepore, the historian, put it, this first Thanksgiving, quote unquote, is the first chapter of the storybook version of American history. And by storybook, she meant that which children can safely read. But we know a lot of other, stuff happened that was really horrible. So before that feast, that sharing of food, there were a series of epidemics that came through the area which killed thousands of people. William Bradford, a couple months before the sharing of food, in 1621, the first Thanksgiving, walked out toward Bristol, 40 miles out, and said there were still bones lying on the surface, that people couldn't bury them, that thousands of Indian people had been killed by these epidemics. So that's what opened the land for the Pilgrims to come in and have this first Thanksgiving. So it's a really strange thing. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we want to undo that, take it apart, dismantle it. I'm going to have a lovely Thanksgiving dinner with my family, but it's not going to be connected at all to that first Thanksgiving. It's just a sharing of food with my family, a nice day. So I want to start with Ellis Sikatow, And she's John's mother. She was medicine woman of the Narragansett Indian tribe for a long time. She was a person of great stature. She taught me many things. She passed on maybe 8 years ago, and I can still remember the day the earth shook, you know. She taught me so many things. And her doctrine was one of coexistence, that Indian people and non-Indian people had many things that they didn't share, but they should try to coexist together. They should try to work together when possible to mutual advantage, and when they couldn't work together, they should just leave each other alone to coexist. And out of that coexistence came collaboration. We collaborated, we worked together on a number of projects. We would travel together sometimes and give talks together, and that was always a great pleasure for me. I remember being really proud. I'd just gotten a new used 2-year-old Subaru station wagon, you know, with all-wheel drive that was going to go through the snow, and we're driving down the road, going to give a talk somewhere, and I said, "Ella, what do you think of the new car?" You know, and she said, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "It just seems like a lot of plastic." She knew that that would sting because she knew I didn't like plastic. But of course she was right. You know, it was just a lot of plastic. And then another time, we were getting ready to go somewhere, and we approached the car, and a bird had flown over and pooped on the door handle. And so I said, "Ella, look at this, how are we going to get in the car?" And she looked at it for a while, and she said, "Must have been an English sparrow." so we cleaned it up. And, you know. So that joke, that humor, that bit of humor, really sums up the whole thing. I mean, with that short, incredibly targeted joke that she made up on the spot, I think she made it up, she took apart the myth of the first Thanksgiving, and turned it into some humor. So she is, you know, we're standing on Narragansett ground. So we honor Ella Sikatow, John's mother. We honor John, we honor his family, and the Narragansett Indian tribe, who opened the door to Roger Williams. And then what happened? So we collaborated. So Ella, you know, established this principle of collaboration based on coexistence. And the way John put it once to me, we were having coffee together, and he said, think of the tribe and the state, how to work with the state, as on 2 parallel railroad tracks. And sometimes they cross. And where they cross, we can work together. So this is an example of where they crossed. This is the Nipsachuk Battlefield Project, the King Philip's War, which is 1675-76. I'm never sure if people know, if y'all know what King Philip's War was. Don't know. My family, which is super well educated, I think, you know, none of them knew what King Philip's War was. It was a horrible conflagration that took place in 1675-76 down in southern New England. It ended in the military aspect of it, ended here in 1676, and then it moved north into Abenaki country, into Vermont and New Hampshire. It got tied up, swallowed up by the war between the French and the English that was going on then. But King Philip's War, up in Nipsachuk, which is North Smithfield, we formed a partnership and got a grant from the National Park Service to find the so-called battles that took place at Nipsachuk. Does anybody know where Nipsachuk is? Nipsachuk is in North Smithfield. It's a Narragansett word. So we worked together. We partnered with the tribe. This is John's office, Narragansett Indian Archaeological Anthropological Committee, or the Narragansett Indian Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and the Blackstone Valley Historical Society. And we went to work to find that place. So this is where it is, up in North Smithfield. This is a USGS map from I think the 1890s or 80s. And so it's got some really nice names on it. So you go up, so down here would become the Providence Place Mall, and then you follow the Woonasquatucket River up to the headwaters, to Matagee Swamp, which is at the base of Nipsachuk Hill. You see Nipsachuk right there. And so King Philip's War started in 1675 when a young English farm boy, kid, shot an Indian person who was, according to the English, stealing a cow from the farm. And then the war started, based on that first killing. Soon after that, this cannot turn into a class on King Philip's War. I'm sorry, just can't. So it's named King Philip's War for Philip, which was the name the English gave to Metacomet, who was the leader of the Pokanoket at the time. So it became known as King Philip's War, but the guy's name is really Metacomet, or Po-Metacomet. So the colonial militia was chasing him out of a swamp in Tiverton, right at the beginning of the war, right after that kid was shot. War broke out. It had been boiling for a while, and it just exploded. So they were chasing him out of the swamp, up across the plain, the Rehoboth Plain, and then up the Blackstone River to Nipsachuk, where they surrounded him. So that was the first battle. There was another battle there too, but it was really a massacre. This is at the end of the war. So the war was short. It was like 16 months long. So one of the first battles was at Nipsachuk, when they were chasing Philip, and he had Weetamoo with him. Weetamoo was the woman, Sachem, the beloved woman, who was incredibly important in the area. And then at the end of the war, a guy named John Telgett from Connecticut led 200 mounted infantrymen, 200 dragoons mounted on horseback, and 100 Mohegan allies, and attacked a couple hundred Narragansett people, mostly old men, children, and women, who camped at the base of Nipsachuk Hill on the edge of Matagee Swamp. What they did was, they separated into two squadrons, the Indian people at the top of the hill, and the mounted horsemen on either side of the hill, and then an appointed signal with a whistle or a gunshot, early in the morning with the sun coming up, they charged down the hill and around the hill and slaughtered over 100 people. This is what I always hesitate to use a slide like this because it means a lot to me. This is the woods at the base of Cat Hill. Remember, two squadrons of dragoons went charging around that hill, and 100 Indians came rushing down the hill. Mohegans were fighting with the English at that time, and they smashed this Narragansett encampment early in the morning as they were waking up. How did that? And so this is what it looks like when you walk through. And the feeling that one gets when you walk through these trees on the edge of the swamp is palpable, because the way Talbot described the fight, the massacre, was that you got 100 horse soldiers on either side and 100 Mohegan soldiers rushing down the hill and just beating and shooting and chasing Indian people into the swamp, dismounting from their horse, and then hacking them to pieces as they tried to escape. And you can feel that incredibly strongly when you walk through those trees. at the edge of the swamp, because you can see the land as it was. You can see, I'll show you this. This is a map that Kevin McBride put together. These are musket balls. The red are groupings of musket balls. This is Cat Hill. This is the swamp. So the horsemen came around like this, and the Mohegan attackers came down like this. And you can see where people, there were very few adult men there. There were very few guns on the Indian side. But you can see where people made a stand, like here and here. And you can see where people got chased. And the people made a stand here and then chased into the swamp. Nipsachuk is a place of thanksgiving. Nipsachuk translates literally as the place where life-sustaining water flows from beneath the earth. That's what Nipsachuk means. The place where life-sustaining water flows from beneath the earth. And so people would gather there for thousands of years at an appointed time to give thanks. So it is a place of thanksgiving. The name itself embraces the idea of thanksgiving. And so this is 1676, as King Philip's War was winding down. The people at this camp that were killed were not sure what they were doing. Some documents suggest that they were on their way to Boston to surrender, and Talcott cut them off and killed them before they could surrender, because Connecticut's trying to take Rhode Island land to be part of Connecticut. I don't know if that's the case, but that's some of the suggestion. But there was no reason for him to do this. And so that's the iconic image of the first Thanksgiving. So how did we get from 1621, those 3 days of food sharing, a harvest celebration, to Nipsachuk? How did we get from that, and leaving aside all the problems of detail with this, just forget about that. It is true, I think, that for 3 days people gathered and shared food. Indian people and non-Indian people, trying their best to understand each other. But just 3 days. And how did we get to Nipsachuk? So to unfreeze this, to unfix this in time, to take apart the myth, we need to know about Nipsachuk. We need to know about King Philip's War. We need to know about the slaughter. We need to know that there are killing fields spread throughout New England where Indian people were massacred, hunted, shot down, chased into the swamp, cut to pieces. We need to know that. We don't need to feel, we need to think about what we should do about that once we hear about it. But it doesn't mean we can't enjoy Thanksgiving. I'm going to enjoy Thanksgiving. Because Thanksgiving has nothing to do with that. Nothing at all. It's just a time when we share food with our family. So this was painted in 1912 by this guy, J.L.G. Ferris. I didn't know who he was before I got ready for this talk. But it was one of 78 images he prepared in a series called The Pageant of a Nation. And it included Columbus coming, and George Washington's farewell address, the sinking of the Lusitania, Lincoln chopping wood, Washington proposing to Martha, George proposing to Martha. A whole series of these iconic images. And this is one of them, and this is what has become Thanksgiving. Fixed in time. But before this, thousands of people were killed in epidemics, brought over by European people. The land laid empty, enabling the pilgrims to come in and build their house. Winslow who I think was deputy governor at the time, wrote to a friend about it. He said, our corn did prove well. God be praised. We had a good increase of Indian corn. See, it was Indian corn. That was the original gift. Indian people gave corn, gave knowledge, gave wisdom to the pilgrims to enable them to grow food, to make the harvest, to serve the food, to live. To live. Pilgrims almost didn't make it that first winter, but the Indians gave them a second chance. They said, here, take this corn, learn how to use it, we'll teach you. So our harvest being gotten in, our governor, that's Bradford, sent 4 men on fowling so we might rejoice together after we gathered the fruits of our labors, at which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms. And so the Indians aren't there yet, but the Indians hear all this shooting going on in their neighborhood. They go, what's that? So the Indians come amongst us, with whom we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer. So the Indians brought deer to the feast, deer to the food, shared food, and gave some to the governor and the captain and others, which is by custom. That's what you do. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time, in other words, we almost starved to death last year, by the goodness of God, we are so far from want. By the goodness of God. So I guess God and the Indians were working together. I don't know, by the goodness of God. I would say by the goodness of the Indian people who lived in my neighborhood. That's what I would have said. We're so far from want. And so to tell you, it's not just that feast. It's the wisdom and it's the ability to go out into the world and find all this stuff and bring it home and keep your family well fed. You know, so I looked at a bunch of archaeological sites around Narragansett Bay. It's a partial list. And not everything on this list was eaten, but these are the remains that were in the archaeological sites. Everything from shellfish to flounder to turkey, nuts, raspberries, strawberries, blueberries. What a wonderful diet. I mean, it was an abundant place. But the pilgrims didn't know how to take advantage of it. The Indians taught them. That was the original gift, the gift that was squandered. And I remember we ended up in Nipsachuk just 50 years from now. You know, Talcott's going to come after me and try to kill me. 50 years before that, I saved his life. So, you know, so this betrayal, this unraveling of the sharing of food started really quickly. In 1623, the Pilgrims got word that a group of Indian people to the north, and I use the word Indian because that's what Ella taught me to say. Ella, she told me that, you know, if you're born here, you're a Native American. But we're Indians. You know, it's a misnomer, but that's what we are. So I just say Indian, and I know it might not sound acceptable to some people, but that's what I do, that's what she taught me. So there are Indian people to the north in Wessagusset, and the Pilgrims got word that these people in Wessagusset were going to come down and attack them. So Miles Standish was sent off on a preemptive raid. He killed a bunch of them, severed the head from one, brought the head back, put it on a pole outside Plymouth as a signal to other Indians what would happen to them if they messed with the Pilgrims. And this was just, you know, 2 years after the feast, 2 years after the first Thanksgiving. Things are really falling apart. And you can see that. I think that's in Provincetown. The monument to Miles Standish. And then things kept deteriorating because more and more and more and more English people were moving in, and they weren't abiding by the obligations of living well in a neighborhood that wasn't yours. You know, they were just taking and taking and taking. And finally, you know, in 1637, there was a massacre at Mystic, where two colonies joined up, Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut, and attacked this village of Pequot people early in the morning, in May, in the spring, between 400 and 700 people were there. Most of the men were away. It was mostly women and children. And they just attacked it, burned it to the ground. Underhill, Captain Underhill, who was from Massachusetts Bay, he commanded the contingent from Massachusetts Bay, said that 400 people were burned alive. And maybe 2 of the English soldiers were wounded or killed. That's a diagram he made of the massacre. He published it, and I forget what the title of the publication was, but it came out a couple of years after that. And so this is the village, palisaded, you know, it's like that. You're looking down. And these are the streets, and you can see the soldiers shooting. This is a circle of soldiers, and then a circle of Indian people who were allied with the English at the time. After that, so the strategy was to set the place on fire, and then people would come running out of the village, and if they weren't burned alive, they'd be shot dead by the English soldiers, and if they got through the English soldiers, the Indian soldiers, warriors, would take them prisoner. And after this, the Indian people met with the English and said, we disapprove of what you did. We take prisoners, we don't commit slaughter. We accompanied you on this expedition thinking we were going to take home some prisoners that we could adopt into our families. We didn't think we were going to kill everybody. And so that just changed everything in southern New England. After that, an Indian person, average Indian person, would not feel safe anymore in her home because you didn't know what those English were going to do. They're irrational. They kill children. They're unpredictable. They say they're going to take prisoners, but then they kill you. And so that was 1637. 16 years after the first Thanksgiving. That iconic image that is like being vaporized. I promise not to talk more than 40 minutes today. So another thing, so this is sort of the vice is tightening on Indian people, you know, militarily. Thousands and thousands of more English people are coming in. You know, so pretty soon English people outnumber Indian people. And the land is being taken. Bounding the vacant land. I've got vacant in quotes because the Massachusetts courts decided that the Indians weren't using the land. You know, because Indian people would move. And so from seasonally and from time to time they'd move and they'd leave land apparently empty while the soil replenished itself. But it wasn't really vacant. But the Massachusetts courts declared it vacant. And if it's vacant, it could be taken. So they took the land. So, you know, you might go down south of URI. You know, URI was where the main village was. You'd have summer camps down along the water, and you'd move. And so if you were an early settler, you know, in 1640, and you're coming into Rhode Island, and you come into the salt ponds, and it's like October, and you find the salt ponds empty, you build your farm, because it's empty, it's vacant. Or so the courts said, but it's not. Roger Williams argued, to his great credit, that Indian people were using all this land, that it wasn't vacant, but the Massachusetts court ruled otherwise. So they just began taking the land and bounding it, gridding it off. It became something else. It became a commodity, something you could buy and sell. So finally, you know, to understand this, to even begin to understand it, you need to know that the Indian people were essentially nonviolent, that Ella taught us that the Indian people who went to war were defenders. They were defenders. They were doing a last resort defense of the land while there was still some left. Another thing you need to understand that's important or useful to understand about this is the importance of women. Women would make policy and men would carry it out. So that first battle at Nipsachuk, when the colonial militia is chasing Philip, he's protecting Weetamoo. That's what he's doing. he's sort of a decoy to protect Udamu, the beloved woman. The woman's squaw. The English could not understand that. They thought the Indians must be short-handed to have all these women involved. But women were of great importance. They made decisions of life and death. When Verrazano sailed into Newport Harbor, I'm digressing, but when Verrazano sailed into Newport Harbor in 1524, he was perplexed. Why are the women staying over here on this island, and why are the men coming on the boat? I want the women to come on the boat. But the women were watching. They were watching the men to make sure the men did what they were told to do. You know, so women made policy and men carried out joyfully. And maybe the other thing that's important to understand about all of this is that the health and prosperity of the individual was inextricably linked to the health and prosperity of the community. There was no difference between the individual and the community. That's symbolized by the Indian idea of the circle. And Roger Williams noticed that and was really impressed by it. He said, hey, there are no beggars here. Everybody is well provided for. Everybody has parents. Everybody's taken care of. It's not the way it was in Europe. And so maybe those three things, you know, to keep in mind. So finally, so the question is, you know, why did it take so long for Indian people to rise up and say enough is enough? But finally things snapped. And they snapped on the east side of Narragansett Bay. And Poe-Metacomet, or Philip, for whom the war is named by the English, King Philip's War, met with a Quaker delegation from Rhode Island before the shooting started. And the Quaker delegation tried to talk Philip, or Metacom, out of going to war. And this is what he said. He harked back to that first Thanksgiving. You know? When the English first came, my father constrained other Indians from wrongdoing you and gave you corn and showed you how to plant. Gave this gift, this original gift. And we even let them have land. Now, the English should do as we did when we were too strong for the English. It's only fair. And the Quaker delegation cautioned Philip against going to war, said you're going to lose because all the English are going to come together and just, it's going to be awful. But they went to war. Benjamin Church is this famous Indian fighter. He's sort of the Davy Crockett of Rhode Island, I think. Philbrook. Nathaniel Philbrook called him in the book after the Mayflower.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, that Philbrook book. And so he was hired. He went to work for Plymouth Colony to fight the Indians. He lived in what's now Little Compton, had a farm. And so one of the things that's puzzled people who have studied this is this. Very early in the war, maybe a month after that farm boy was shot, no, the farm boy shot the Indian in Swansea, maybe a month after that, Church has gone to work for Plymouth and he is tracking Indian people, you know, trying to catch up to them and capture them or kill them. And he goes down, you know, through Tiverton to this place. And if you're at Fogland Beach in Little Compton, I think, you look up, you know, in back of you, and there's the hill. It was called the Peace Field by Benjamin Church, who left a diary of his battles with Indian people. And so John Almey's Pea Field, he describes how they were beset by, you know, trapped by 300 Indians. There were 20 guys with Benjamin Church. It was 300 to 20. And they came under fire from the Indian people. It lasted for 6 hours. And Church describes how bullets were just going all around him, you know, over his head, hitting rocks next to him. A boat sailed over from an island out in the middle of the bay. And they were going to take Church's men off to rescue them. Was that me beeping or somebody else?
Your mic is a little too close to your mouth. Not that far.
Anyway, the Indian marksmen, riflemen, shredded the sails of the boat. The boat turned away. The boat eventually came back, and they began taking guys off. Guys, you know, he had 20 men with him. And they began taking them off, one by one. Meanwhile, bullets are flying. You know, 300 Indians are shooting their guns. And nobody's getting hit. Finally, all 20 of his men are out safely aboard the ship after several hours of this. And Church's next in command says, "Okay, Benjamin, time to go." And he says, "Oops, forgot my sword and I forgot my hat. I left it back at the spring. I have to go back and get it." And they say, "No, don't go back, you'll be killed." He says, "I'm going back." And so bravely he goes back, he's getting shot at, bullets are flying around. He describes this in his diary. Gets his hat and sword and makes it back, bullets fly, gets on the boat, bullet hits right here where he's sitting. They make it away. Not a single soldier is hit by a bullet. 6 hours, 300 Indians shooting at him. And so Church says, by the providence of God, you know, we made it safe at home. But if you keep in mind this principle, one of the principles that Ellis Ikotok taught, and you can see in the documents that these Indian people are essentially nonviolent. What they were doing was just telling Benjamin Church to go away. They were shooting over him, around him, bam, boom, boom, boom. And he says, by the grace of God, and then he says, I was saved. And then he says, diplomacy's over. You know, I thought we could do diplomacy with these Indian people, but we can't, they're nasty. They were just telling him to go away. I'm sure of it. And this war, whatever it was, had just started. You know, they're saying, we can stop this thing, go away, leave us alone, coexist, as Allah would say. But by the grace of God, they continued fighting. So they went into the Great Swamp in South Kingstown and burned down an Narragansett refugee village. I don't know, 1,000 people or more burned to death. And now the land, happily, it was turned over. The Rhode Island Historical Society owned it for many, many years. They turned it back, gave it back to the Narragansett Indian tribe just within a year. So now the tribe's taking care of it. But this was a, you know, the war heated up. It didn't have to. Indian people gave Church a chance to go home. But look at the destruction. I mean, if you're on the English side, you went through a lot. I mean, because for the first several months of this war, the English were back on their heels. It didn't have to end in Indian defeat the way it ended. It didn't look like it was going to. 1676 New England Casualty Report published by Nathaniel Saltonstall. In Narragansett, not one house left. At Warwick, but one. Providence, not above 3. And on and on and on. So when Providence was being burned to the ground, Roger Williams said, I'm going out there and I'm talking to these Indian people and I'm going to get them to stop. You know, and his friends told him not to go. But he did. And he met up with somebody, I don't know who it was, met up with an Indian defender, Narragansett defender, and Williams scolded him. He said, you're running about the countryside, devouring it like wolves. Why are you doing this? As they burned down close to a couple hundred houses in Providence. And the Indian guy said, you've driven us to it. We're in a strange way. We're in a strange way. Which means we're not normally like this. You know, this is different. We've never done this before. Miantinomo, 30 years before the war, he was a Narragansett sachem, tried to get the Indians together to push the English back into the ocean. And he said, among other things, he said, we have to become like them to beat them, and we have to do it now before it's too late. We have to become like them. So this guy who met Roger Williams in 1676, as Providence is being burned to the ground, you know, told him really clearly, we're in a strange way. We're not like this. And then Miantanomi said earlier, he said, after we kill them, and we're going to have to kill them, we'll go back to being the way we were. So the English got wind of that and they had Miantanomi assassinated. I can't talk about everything, sorry. So Mary Rowlandson, you probably heard of her. She was taken into captivity by Indian people in the middle of King Philip's War in February 1676 outside of Lancaster. A group of Indian people, bam, hit Lancaster, burned down the garrison house and took a bunch of people captivity. This is what she describes. So then she went on not a march, but they were on the run because colonial militia was after these Indian people. And there were maybe 1,000 or more. I have to go back. On this long run, from again, on the run constantly, grabbing, going out on guerrilla warfare, going out hitting these villages and then coming back, hitting these villages and coming back. On the run, women and children, old women, old men, and the defenders. It's an amazing thing that the Indian people could pull this off. And so Mary Rowlandson is with them, and this is, think back to Thanksgiving when they were sharing food. This is what they're eating now. Their corn was destroyed because the English people destroyed the cornfields. They were driven from what little they had. Their stores were gone in the middle of winter. Thinking of the winter coming on in Ukraine, it happened here. Many times they would eat that. They would eat a hog. They would eat that. They would eat that a hog or a dog would hardly touch. The chief and commonest food was ground nuts. They'd pick up old bones full of worms and maggots. They would scald the worms and maggots and eat them. Anything to stay alive. Yea, the very bark of trees. Besides that, which they plundered from the English, because there was great excitement in the camp. If the defenders came back after the raid with a bunch of cattle, that would help for a while. But the war is winding down. Wait a minute. The war is winding down. The English have Indians on the run. And without their food stores, without their villages, without their seed corn, there wasn't much they could do. And Paul Metacomet was killed in August 1676 in Bristol. And that was the end of military activities here in Rhode Island, or here in southern New England. They continued to the north, but not here. The real Thanksgiving, if there can be such a thing, happened in Plymouth on August 17, 1676, when Philip was killed, when Metacomet was killed. And these are the words of Increase Mather, a Puritan author and official. A little before Philip was killed, in August 1676, the authority in that colony had appointed the 17th to be observed as a public Thanksgiving throughout that jurisdiction. And God delivered Philip into their hands a few days, can you imagine that, before the intended Thanksgiving. Thus did God break the head of that Leviathan and brought it to the town of Plymouth, where they put it on a pike, and it stood outside Plymouth for 30 years at least, until it was decayed. Very sad. It's very sad when you think about how it started. Because this iconic idea, this mythic idea of Thanksgiving was real for 3 days. It was an opportunity squandered by the English. But the Indians gave them this knowledge to grow their own corn, to raise their own food, to go hunting, to live on the land. But they lived on the land differently. Wow, I gotta stop. So Divine Deloria Jr. was a Native American, North American philosopher of great reputation. And he just made this simple statement: American Indians hold their lands, their places, as having the highest possible meaning, and all statements are made in reference to this point, the highest possible. So you lose your land. It's not just sad, it leaves you hollowed out. Because you don't only lose the land, you lose the land and all it holds. And it holds a lot. Nipsachuk this place of massacre just a month before Philip's head was put on the pole outside Plymouth, was the place where life-sustaining water flowed from beneath the earth. It's a Thanksgiving. And so if you lose that, so Nipsachuk became North Smithfield. Nipsachuk, this place of communal gathering and ceremony, became Smith's North Field. North Smithfield, fenced off. You can't come here anymore, it's my land. It's my commodity, I paid for it. Well, he didn't pay for it, he killed a bunch of Indians so he could live there. But that transformation of land from a place of great spirit and ceremony to land as a commodity, Smith's Field. That's why it heartens me to see Nipsachuk on the map still. Because Nipsachuk is the place where life-sustaining water flows from beneath the earth. And then Jessie Little-Doe-Baird has this phenomenal language reclamation project at Mashpee. And she says to lose the right to use one's land is to literally fall off your feet, to have no ground under you. And prior to white people coming here, our feet never left the ground. My land is not separate from my body. So the land, the place, is who I am. We're inseparable. And remember that other, 5 more minutes, that other principle, the principle that Ella Sikatow taught through, she didn't say this explicitly, but through act and, what's it called? Through act and example. Act and example. Yes. Through act and example, she taught that the health and well-being of the individual is inextricable from the health and well-being of the community. We work together, we pull together. If one of us is sick, all of us are sick. The land is not separate from my body. The land and all it holds is part of my community. It's alive and it nourishes me. And I nourish it. For her. It's not an it. Roger Williams, we're almost done. He noticed that Narragansett had a word, Squannet, which was a woman's god. And Paula Gunn Allen, a Native American scholar of high repute, said the health and well-being of Squannet is the health and well-being of the earth, and its creatures, human and otherwise, are dependent on her for their own health and well-being. Reciprocity. This field of relationships, the land is full of things. And this guy, I don't know who Mona Quasin was, but he left behind some words that are just quite... When I first heard instruction, I left. So he's at a praying town, and the people at Massachusetts Bay are trying to convert him to Christianity. And so he said, when I first heard Christian instruction, I laughed at it and scorned praying to God. I did think of running away because I could not pray to God, but because I loved the place where I lived, I thought, I will pray to God so I can stay at that place. Therefore, I prayed not for the love of God, but for the love of the place I lived in. Now I said, I believe in God, but this I said with my mouth, I did not believe it in my heart. So you hear about how Indians were converted to Christianity. Not this guy. And I think he represents a lot of other guys. And so I don't know, maybe John can talk about this later, but the true Thanksgiving, the real Thanksgiving, takes place on a continuous basis. You're giving thanks. There's a Narragansett phrase that I heard at a ceremony for one of John's family members the other day. And I think I know how to pronounce this, and then I hear somebody who knows how to pronounce it, and I go, oh my God, you know. But Tabutin Tamak Uchiwami, we are giving thanks for all things. And that's the symbol of the Narragansett Indian Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And that's the circle, the egalitarian nature of things, the field of relationships, the community, the inextricable relationship between individuals and community, represented by those concentric circles and the dots. And we could go on about this for hours. But it's not, I don't mean to laugh, I'm not laughing, I'm really crying because this is horrible, horrible stuff. And so what do? You know, so we try to work together, we try to collaborate, we try to coexist, like Ellis said. I took a cross-country trip a few years ago, and in Nebraska, some of the descendants of the original homesteaders, you know, in the 19th century, the land was taken from Indians and then given to homesteaders. They're trying to work with the Pawnee to bring back indigenous plants. And these are spotted like the horse beans. And if you've ever seen a Palomino pony, you know, the spots, they are beautiful beans. They're drought resistant. And there are programs all, you know, throughout Nebraska. The Pawnee people and the, you know, descendants of the homesteaders trying to figure out what to do about this mess that we're in. Anyway, so I just like that. I just like that photograph. And then finally, you know, up in Turner's Falls. Turner's Falls was where a late massacre was in King Philip's War in May 1676. But the farm boys were recruited by Captain Turner to go attack this refugee village that the Narragansett were supervising at Turner's Falls at the Connecticut River. Great falls. So early in the morning again, you know, they went down the hill and attacked this village of refugees, pushed, shot, otherwise, into the river, over the falls, killed lots of people. And there were people in Turner's Falls to this day who think there's a curse on the town because of what Turner did, Turner's Falls, in May 1676. So they invited Narragansett people to come up and do a reconciliation ceremony to try to begin to pick up the pieces and move on and figure out, not move on, but to pick up the pieces and put something back together and figure out what to do. So they did a reconciliation ceremony, and that's John's uncle, who was medicine man before John. And these words are really important. To acknowledge the tragic events that took place on the shores of this river, and thereby begin to put the tragic echoes of the past to rest. Begin. That word begin. Now, so it's where the people in Turner's Falls decided to begin to work together. So that was 2004, a long time ago, and they've done lots of stuff since then. That's an amazing area with lots of good people. They're trying hard to figure out what to do. So if any of you know what to do, I mean, besides go and have a really nice Thanksgiving dinner, which you gotta do, you know, maybe you can tell us. But I just get, my heart breaks when I go through this. It's really hard for me. And so I hope it hasn't been hard for you to listen. But I'm done. So thanks. So this, you don't get the chance to talk to the medicine man very often. So.
Can you folks hear me out there?
Yes.
That's a hard follow, and I'm an Narragansett Indian, and I'm supposed to know something. So rather than talk, I kind of figured that I'd open it up for you folks to have, if you have any questions, to either Paul or myself. You took much of my thunder, what I was going to say. So we don't need to really rehash that. If you have any questions, just ask the questions and we'll do our best.
Can you talk about what the Narragansett Tribal Preservation Commission office does?
In 1966, what was the lady's name? What was her name? The lady that created the National Historic Preservation Act. The lady that created the National Historic Preservation Act.
I don't.
You talking about Downing? No.
Antoinette Downing.
Okay.
Yes.
That's right.
Oh, okay, here in Rhode Island.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. She created the act, the National Act. She was able, a lady by the name of Antoinette Downing was able to convince the local senators and several of the other senators in Washington to pass a bill that created the National Historic Preservation Act. That act was intended to preserve America's treasures. It was originally based primarily on buildings and structures from the colonial era forward to whatever was considered an antique. Anything that was over 100 years old, I guess, at that time. That was done in 1966. It was reauthorized in 1968. Within the 1968 reauthorization, there was a great deal more authority that was laid into the act and began the process of the creation of the state historic preservation offices. And it allowed the states to assume a certain authority in the protection of historic properties within their jurisdiction. What it did not do, it also affected any federal enclave, a federal reserve. So that included Indian lands, either federal trust lands, lands in which the tribes had aboriginal title, or reservation lands. It took from 1968 to 1992 for the act to be amended to include Indian tribes, and primarily that was because in the creation of the act, it gave rise to a more concise form of archaeology and anthropology. This was done, however, a lot of the stories of the history of the different sites that were found that belonged to the indigenous people did not carry their history with it. It carried the interpretation of people that went to school for the purposes of learning how to be an archaeologist or an anthropologist. That did not necessarily carry the tribe's knowledge of itself, or a tribe's knowledge of itself. In 1992, that act was amended to include Indian tribes. That was short-lived in the sense because, I don't know if it was 2018 or 2017, it was reauthorized. It was moved from Title 16, it was 16 U.S.C. 470, U.S.C. United States Code 470 A to Z. It's been moved now to Title 54, 54 United States Code, and it starts at 300, Section 300, 101, et sequius, moves on. So, in the original amendment, it put the tribes at par with the states and allowed the tribes to assume the jurisdiction concerning their historic properties. And it was not bordered by the tribe's lands. The primary switch on any of those circumstances were the expenditures of federal funds or the application of federal right or entitlement through its agencies or departments, the several departments or agencies of the United States. In that way, we could then come in at equal with the state historic preservation offices and begin doing the work that was necessary to tell our understanding of the history of a particular site. Paul mentions working with Nipsachuk. We did that. In the Turner Falls area, we did that as well. My office was directly involved in that. There was a guy by the name of Mackin that had a sandbank that really wasn't a sandbank, it was a burial ground. And he destroyed a good portion of it, probably about 3 acres. And we asked him to stop, and he wouldn't stop. And I took him into federal court. And the federal judge was going to put that old man in jail. And before the judge made his ruling, he came back and he pleaded with us not to do that. And I said, well, Mr. Mackin, I said, you're going to have to do something better than you've been doing, digging up the bones of our people and throwing them on your roads in the local area or shipping them out of state. eventually, the Friends of Wissatinawag, which was a group of tribal people and non-tribal people, ended up getting that property, the Mack and Sandbank property. And I believe the ceremony started in the middle of the town and ended up at that Friends of Wissatinawag property. Right up near Turner's Falls. Turner's Falls was just over the hill, just to the east of it. So my work primarily is to preserve the history and culture of the Narragansett Indian tribe, or any Indian tribe really, wherever it may be. And to tell that story, to tell those stories that are necessary to connect what was happening on the land to the people that were there. Their understanding of the history, their understanding of the usage, as Paul was saying earlier. So that's primarily what I do. I work with every federal agency and local agency, private person in 7 states. That's the area that my office has jurisdiction. So that's what I do.
Yeah, thank you for doing this, by the way, both of you. This is fascinating. And I think it's really good to have a forum where people can get together and hear these stories. And so I'm wondering, would you recommend an online forum or forums, places where you might go and learn more locally or nationally or internationally along these lines? And
If anybody wants to know what we know, give me a call. I'm not a hard man to find. You see, within the tribe, within the Narragansett tribe at least, I won't speak for any of the other Indian tribes, to know the history, the culture, the tradition. I happen to be one of those people. There's not much in Rhode Island by way of historic sites that I don't know, or if we come across it, I don't know what it is. I was trained very well by some of the people that Paul mentioned. One of the things that my mother had done back when I was young and stupid, still old and stupid, but I was young and stupid at that time. We moved from Rhode Island to Plymouth, Massachusetts. And I don't know, I was 15 or 16 years of age, going from 9th grade to 10th grade. And we worked there at the Plymouth Plantation. She created the Native American Studies program up there. In that, we worked with an archaeologist and an anthropologist by the name of Jim Dietz. Wonderful fellow. In fact, all of his family was wonderful. We created a 17th century tribal village. That woman created that from memory. And so she was able to build an exact replica of what you would have found in the 17th century. And that will tell you the type of knowledge that she retained and what she was taught. And she would tell me, John, she said, I listened very well. I listened very well, John Brown. When the old timers came over, I was 5 or 6 or 7 years old. She said, I sat in the corner near the fireplace, and she said, I listened. And she had the skill as well. She knew where to go to get all the plants that were necessary to build that structure. And then a crew of about 20 would put it together. I didn't really want that type of skill, to have that type of skill. So I never learned those things that I should have learned. But she reintroduced the basket making in this area. She reintroduced the mat making, the several types of mats that were required, from cedar bark mats to the bulrush to the cattail. She reintroduced that to the tribal people that she worked with in the local area. When I mean local, if we're sitting here 100 miles in any direction, 150 miles in any direction. So she had a great deal of skill and a great deal of knowledge. What she did pass on, her and my uncle, what they passed on to me, I can tell anyone that would give me a call. It's not something that we put on the internet. It's not something that we often write about. Perhaps we should, but we don't. What was that movie with Jim Carrey where they ended up filming his whole life?
Oh, the Truman Show?
Yeah,
The Truman Show?
yeah. I mean, who wants to be that? And what you're asking is for us to become that. And that's just a caricature of what we truly are. So, no, we can't do all of that. But if somebody has a specific question, or they need a specific bit of knowledge, I can help you out there. But as far as putting on the dog and pony show, that's not my forte. So, if you want to know what we know, come and ask us, we'll tell you as best we can.
I'm just interested in any stories you want to tell us about some of the land sites that we know. For instance, the site of the Great Swamp Massacre that we saw the slide about. For instance, Mount Hope. For instance, anything locally in Providence that you could tell us about.
What would be the purpose of telling you about it?
Oh, yeah, to know the history is to understand a little bit, a teeny bit, because we can't really understand fully what it is to be you or your people. But maybe we can learn and listen, and I would just like to hear, because I know that the land and walking on the land, I saw that movie about the Wampanoag reclamation of the language, and felt that it said very well about what we, she said that the people felt like they were separated from the earth. And so I'm just curious about anything that you want to tell us about connection with the earth, but in particular the earth that we all know. That is
If you want something just how we feel about our connection with the earth, that I can do.
Sure.
They don't have to be related to any specific place. Like with any culture, you have places today that you go to because they call out to you, or your children are interested, or your grandchildren are interested in it. And so you go to these places. I don't care if it's Providence Place Mall, or it's somewhere down by a beach. For Narragansett, it would have been the same. Our connection to those places are eons, hundreds, if not thousands of eons old. We're much older than people give us credit for. Probably the only people on this planet that's older than us are the Oriental. But we have been coming to these places since they called to us, and since we needed to be there. And that's what our feeling for those places comes from. Nature provides, and it presents. And if you're wise, and you listen with your heart rather than your mind, you can see what nature provides. And watch the animals, watch nature, watch the plants, and you go to those places. We simply were wise enough or open enough to go to those places that nature provided. So we watched the animals, we watched the plants, and we showed up when those things were either at the greatest peak or at the lowest ebb. And it depended upon the people why they did that and for what particular reason. It doesn't matter, where the place is at in general. There are some places that we go that we do ceremony. We've been doing it for the last 100,000 years or more.
Sitting here, I realize I really don't know the responsibilities and the work that it's done, that a medicine man or medicine person does. Could you explain them?
Doing it here tonight.
Is there, I'm trying to wrap my head around it. Is there a philosophy of it? Is there I mean, is it related to healing? Is it related to mental health? Is it related to history?
All of the above.
It is.
It's the best way to explain it. The position for my people is hereditary. It's the last position in the Narragansett tribe that is attained by bloodline. I don't know if anyone will follow me. I haven't chosen someone. But it came to me from those two people, that man and that lady that you saw up on the screen tonight. It came to them from their parents and the parents before them. And so the teaching is broad. It takes in just about every element of your science, mathematics, sociology, psychology, psychiatry. You examine all of those disciplines, but it is, as Paul said, it is treated from the point of the circle or the sphere, not from the independent towers, ivory towers that are created in this society with those different disciplines. And so you deal with medicine, deal with botany, physiology, anatomy, chemistry, organic chemistry. You have to become proficient or at least know the rudiments of those things to be able to address the needs of the people or the needs of the plants or the planet or the animals. So I've had to learn a lot. I started at the age of 16. I did not become the tribal medicine man. It's been 8 or 9 years since the passing of my uncle. So maybe 8 years. So 16 to 56, 57. So that's 40-some years. So the training I got was replete. But like with all things, anybody can learn more. I'm of sufficient age now that I know one thing, I don't want to know anymore. I know enough. And that which I don't know, I can guess. Be somewhere, best guess, somewhere in the bullseye. To be all is to be nothing. And there's no sense in trying to be all. We're beings that are in the process of learning. We haven't learned it all. If you did, there'd be no mystery. And what would you guys be doing here? And what would I be doing here? Besides entertaining my friend, because he came down to visit me. And that's what this was going to be. 2 old men sitting at a table talking to you. And I see another old man out there that I knew for many years that we've walked many miles together. And so it's worth it.
But that, I mean, but there was a great opportunity missed by the English people who arrived here in the 17th century. They destroyed, left in pieces. They didn't destroy it completely, but they left in pieces and refused to listen with their hearts. Instead, and Roger Williams made a point of not going to the ceremonies. He was invited, but he didn't go.
He was afraid.
He was afraid. And the son of the Quayapan, who was killed at Nipsachuk, told the English, when they were arguing over Jamestown, the English said, "You sold us Jamestown in Squatok." Told, "We didn't sell it to you, we're letting you use it. And in exchange for using it, you need to come to our ceremonies. You need to follow the rules of the neighborhood. You know, here you are. You should live appropriately. and the English just refused to do it. And it was such a waste, you know, when I look back on that time, such a horrible waste.
You gotta look at it like this. I very seldom told Pierre and told Paul this, but folks, all knowledge is out there. You simply have to be of a capacity to avail yourself to its learning. That learning does not come all at once. It takes a long, long time to teach children. Even the most advanced of children, or those that think they're advanced, they're still just children. They think they know. And what do they really know? And they might know things, but you take those things, anyone in this room that you think you know, try to apply that in the middle of a field when it's 30 below. That's going to teach you how much you really know. Now, if you survive it, several minutes, several hours, several days, you will have learned an increment about what it's really about. This was the message that my ancestors tried to teach these strangers. But they came from a dissimilar way of being. And that way of being was, you feasted on what you thought was the poor, or the weak, or the ignorant. You took advantage of them. You didn't help rise them up or raise them up to be like you. You grabbed whatever you could grab and kept it to yourself. You didn't share it. Our understanding was just the opposite. That eventually, human beings are going to need other human beings. And to get that assistance in those times of trouble or those times of need, you have to share with them so that they may share with you. Understand that sharing with someone does not necessarily mean that they're going to share with you in the same way. That's all part of the equation. Those people, they were great, but like all things that are of human making, they are just a spot on the paper of time. And when put under the sun, eventually that spot fades. So if we have to go the way of the West, and our ways are unknown, you can be rest assured that there's going to be a lot of people going with us eventually. But somewhere along the line, maybe one person or two people, if not in the immediate future, in the far future, if humans are still here, might have learned the increment. You see, you don't know what you're really here to learn and why you're here to learn it. If anyone in this room, right here and now, knows all of that, please tell me. Because I'm somebody that's supposed to know. And like I said, I know one thing, I know enough, and don't want to know everything else. We are beings that are in the process of learning. Humans want to try to force that. They're doing that now in this society. Doing terrible things to further themselves, but they haven't furthered their mind and they haven't furthered their heart. It's like in that old Star Trek movie where, what was it, one of the first ones, where no man has gone before, or the third one I think it was. They went to the edge of the galaxy, went into an energy ribbon at the edge of the galaxy. And a couple of their crew people were transformed. And they managed on getting their ship back out of the galaxy, but their ability to travel faster than light was destroyed, so they had to find a close place. So they found this close place. And getting there took several weeks. And these two people started to change. And they became people of immense capability. And they actually became a threat to the people on the ship, because they gained all of this knowledge. They had sprung so far ahead. So they had the raw knowledge and the knowledge on how to use that knowledge. But they couldn't temper that with wisdom or understanding. And thus they became a threat to the very people that they had supposedly had advanced beyond. That is always the danger in humanity. Especially when one society thinks it knows more than the other society. That's a terrible danger. The planet put people where they were at for a particular reason. And people stayed in those areas for a particular reason. As knowledgeable as anyone is, you can't go from here to the desert and here to the Arctic and acclimate and live like it's your normal place. It takes days, weeks, months, or years. And so even if you had the knowledge, those people that were living in that space, they know where to go to get water. They know where to go to get food. That may be all that we're supposed to do at this time. Learn our surroundings. Learn what we're supposed to be to one another. And then, when you're ready, maybe reach for the stars. I want to tell you, if I was an advanced race out there in the world, I mean the world beyond us, I wouldn't want to come to this planet. They came here a long time ago and left. They left us in peace. They talked with us and left us alone. The people here, they haven't done the same thing. And their absolute need to climb the ladder to get to a place they haven't merited by deed or understanding. I think that's what the people back then were saying. Oh, and one thing he did say, the only reason why we fed those folks back then was to stop digging up the things in the graves and taking our winter stores that we use for planting the next year. They were starving, and so we fed them. Imagine being in the 1600s in a place where you could drink even from the largest rivers. The water was clean, absolutely pure. And not knowing how to fish, not knowing how to hunt, not even being able to go down to the seashore and get oysters and quahogs, which at that time of the year were plentiful. Before the waters froze over, I mean, you just scoop them up with your hands. Back then, they were probably, an oyster was probably that long, that thick. But where they came from, the waters were so polluted that you couldn't eat the fish from the rivers. You couldn't eat anything that came from the rivers that flowed into the ocean, polluted the oceans. So anything along the shores, you couldn't eat that really. To fish, you had to go out a distance where that water was diluted and many of the toxins bled away. But that's why they were starving. They didn't apply the sight that was right in front of them. And so they took what they found, or what they thought they found. And imagine that type of thinking. What would any one of you do with somebody like that if they came in your house today? Just walked in your house and said, I'm here. Get your kids out of the house. I'm gonna, rob your house, and I'm gonna, take what you got from your refrigerator. Oh, I'm gonna take your conveyance and that's going with me. Because that's the way it was. That was the thinking. Now, that's not too advanced type of thinking. I don't care how you look at it. That's at a lower scale of even being a human. But their presumption of themselves was quite extraordinary. And for any of the other folks up there that say they don't know, and you don't know about this, and you don't know about that, they have this wonderful device nowadays. Just give it a shot. It's called the internet.
Be careful.
And you can just plug in some values and you can find out most of it. If you need that refined, as Paul indicated, then we can help refine that. Well, much of the history that was told here today, we simply added to the colonial record because we had that particular knowledge that was held within us. Think of anything that you would hold dear or you would love, that you would want protected. And we had the same feelings and still have the same feelings. I don't know what else to say besides that. And we ran over time,
Yeah.
That's okay, we'll have another question right here,
okay?
and then we'll wrap it
All
up.
right.
I haven't had an opportunity to speak with a Native American about this, but from what I've heard tonight, there's going to be tremendous sadness, bitterness that you're dealing with and you've dealt with for centuries.
Is that what you think?
How do you do that? Yeah, I wonder, I don't know.
Like I said, son, you got a lot to learn. Well, I understand why he's here. But we were here before there was America. So Native American, that's a colloquialism that is used in modern day to be diplomatic, proper. But I'm Narragansett. If I'm speaking to you about what you should know and how you should know it, that's simply a telling of the tale. As far as being angry at you, or anybody for that matter, I got better things to do. When I leave here, I'm going to get in my 2011 F-250. I'm going to drink my water that I bought here tonight. And I'm going to think about going home and on my 60-inch screen playing my video games. So I'm not going to be thinking too much about being angry at anybody. So you might want to ask yourself why you're asking that question. It's what you're taught, and it's how you're taught to think. That's one of the conundrums that Paul was talking about today, the story of America and how people in this world posit themselves to see other people and people they live in not too far from. You should probably go back and rethink that before you ask those type of questions again. You might insult somebody's intelligence in a wrong place, and they may not be as diplomatic as I'm being. That wasn't a question I would be prepared to answer, because I don't think about you or you folks here, I'm sorry. Just like you don't think about me, I don't think about you. I mean, what would be the purpose beyond this immediate conversation? And I said it now 5 times, I did this because I've known this man back before we had gray hair. And we could actually run, right? Run and jump, right?
You can jump.
Yeah. So
Yeah, we could jump.
1981, right? 1980,
Yeah.
1980,
Maybe take a jump you just hit.
42 years.
Yeah, we could jump and we bounce around.
Same thing with Pierre back there.
Yeah.
So all those things that we might have used to talk about when we were younger, about such things, we don't have to anymore. We turn them on.
But you know, there's just so much. I mean, there's just so much. It was really hard. Well, see, I haven't done this in a couple of years. And it was really hard to come in and try to condense this thing into 30 or 40 minutes. It was really difficult for me. And so, there's a lot that was awful. You know, they're just, and it was a missed opportunity. And it just layer upon layer upon layer. And for John to be as relaxed about this as he is just incredible to me. Because as long as I've been doing this, and I've been doing it most of my adult life, I think I've reached bottom, that I've learned, the last worst thing, and then something else comes along. Something else comes along. So it's just so deep, and it's so layered, and it's so misunderstood, and it's so tangled up. And if somehow we could just find a way to untangle it, I think we'd all be better for it. But it's so tangled up.
Failing of society, and that's all of us. So we all hold an element of that failure, with or without knowledge. Any other questions?
Would you like to run for president?
Did Trump announce tonight, do you know?
I don't know.
No.
I just, his wisdom is,
Oh, John, yeah, for sure.
I was trained by the best that we've had in the last 2 centuries.
When we started with John's mother and
I would like to thank John and Paul for sharing of yourselves tonight, because
Sure.
that's what you both did. And I would like to thank you all for coming and for being open to receiving what they've offered to us.